Today on Inside Base Camp, a daughter seeks revenge on the terrorist who shot her father.
Omar gasped. His sister burst into tears, and the judges kind of fell back in their seats. They said to me, "Why would you do such a thing? Why would you do such a crazy and dangerous thing?"
A tale of vengeance around the world.
I went to places like Albania, where revenge isn't only tolerated, but it's demanded.
With an ending right out of Hollywood.
It's a fairy tale, but it's a true one. This really happened.
Around the world, around the clock, the adventure never ends. And here is where it begins, inside Base Camp.
Welcome to Inside Base Camp. I'm Tom Foreman. Wanting to punish people for something they've done to you is as natural a human emotion as love. But how far would you go to avenge a misdeed? When Laura Blumenfeld's father was shot by a terrorist, she found the desire for vengeance overwhelming and the results utterly unpredictable. So let's turn to our fact file for more about her. Laura is 38 years old and American. She was educated at Harvard University and writes for the Washington Post. She's also married to a lawyer who is part of anti-terrorism efforts at the U.S. Treasury Department and the mother of 2 small children. Family is important to Laura. She's always been very close to her parents, who she says created a world of exquisite illusion for her, an illusion that the world was a beautiful place. But in the winter of 1986, that illusion was shattered. A Palestinian gunman in the old city of Jerusalem randomly shot her father in the head. Her search for the gunman became an obsession, leading her to deceive his family and, in an extraordinary moment of truth, to a direct confrontation with the man himself. Laura chronicles all of this in a new book called Revenge, a Story of Hope. And Laura Blumenfeld is with us now inside Base Camp. Thanks for coming here.
Thank you.
I want to ask you right off the top, you call it a story of hope. Why?
Well, it's a story that begins really with violence, with a shooting and feelings of revenge, but it ends in redemption. Because I did find, traveling through my own feelings of revenge and traveling around the world talking to other Avengers, that you can get past the animosity.
Let's go to a critical moment in that travel where you start your own book. A hot day in July, a dozen years after your father was shot, you're suddenly standing at the door of a house and you know inside is the family of the man who shot your father.
As you described it, it was a hot day, and I get a chill, actually, even thinking about it. I had a list of names. They were essentially suspects. I didn't have telephone numbers. I didn't have addresses. I just had their names, and so I was wandering door to door, knocking on doors until I came to the correct one. Omar Khatib was the gunman. His mother opened the door, and I asked for him, and she said, "He's not here. He tried to kill a man. He shot him one time in the head."
Was that the moment that you knew you were at the right house?
I didn't know yet. I said, "Well, who did he shoot?" And her grandson, a 12-year-old boy sitting on the sofa next to me, shrugged and just said, "Some Jew." And then they started to talk about an American man from New York walking through the souvenir market in Jerusalem when their son stepped out of an alley and raised a pistol to his head. And this feeling began to wash over me as I realized that they were talking about my father.
And you'd been invited into their home. You were sitting there with them. Had you told them who you were?
Yes and no. I told them I was Laura, and I'm a reporter from America writing a book about revenge. And I'm interested in hearing your story. What I withheld was my last name, Blumenfeld, which is the same as my father's name, and that I was actually looking for their son.
As this started to unfold, first of all, you had to confront the story of what happened to your father. Tell us the specifics of that.
I was a college kid. I was in my dorm, and I got a phone call one night. My father was in Jerusalem just for 1 week. He was a tourist, walking back to his hotel, and he called me from the hospital and said, "Honey, you're going to hear something on the news, and I want you to know that I'm okay. And no matter what you hear, I am all right." Because the initial news reports out of Jerusalem were that he had been shot in the head and killed. He got lucky, although there were other tourists targeted by the same gang who were shot also point blank and were killed. And I was completely overwhelmed. I was young, getting ready to step out into the world, and I just thought, what is this world that I'm stepping into?
At this time, what was happening is a small terrorist group, very well organized, had decided that by terrorizing and killing tourist to the area, they could support their cause, which was an anti-Israeli cause.
They could get attention. And when I first met the family and they didn't know who I was and didn't know I was there, I said, well, why did they do this? And they said, you know, it was public relations. It was a way for people to see our cause.
And they, as they sat in this family and visited with you, a dozen family members wandered in and out. They had no problem at all with what had happened at that point.
No, they didn't. They were proud of it in a sense. Their son was standing up for their beliefs, and this was their way of communicating their beliefs. That's what was so horrifying to me, that this mindset, really, a terrorist mindset, which says you can kill civilians randomly to make a political point.
You had no idea at that moment that this was going to grow into quite a long relationship with this family. Tell me about how that started growing and you started making contact with the gunman.
Well, I actually found out soon enough that the gunman had been rounded up along with the other gunmen and had put in prison. There was no way for me to reach him. The only way that I could communicate with him was through the family. They would visit him every other week and smuggle letters back and forth between me and the gunman.
And you kept going to their house every couple of weeks, and you would sit down with them, and you'd look through family pictures, and you'd share tea.
Right.
And you were social with them.
I was social with them. Other than wanting my father dead, they were very nice people. They were very warm and welcoming, and also were doing me a favor. They wrapped up these little letters and sealed them in plastic packets and would spit them out when they would have these meetings with Omar, with the gunman, so that we could communicate. He wrote English. I spoke Arabic and English with him, never revealing that I was Jewish, and then I spoke Hebrew as well.
You were living a fraud this whole time.
Absolutely, I was divided. I was the reporter Laura, and who was looking at revenge from the outside, traveling around the world just as an intellectual exercise, really, to unravel this concept of revenge. And then I was also looking at revenge from the inside. I was an avenging daughter.
What was going on inside you as the weeks went in and out? There had to be moments you're around people like this where you felt close to them as human beings. What did you feel like at those moments?
I felt very flustered and confused because there were times where I got so caught up in pretending to like them, I actually did like them. I can remember sitting with them one day, and one of the daughters was pregnant, and they were talking about baby names for the baby. And they said, well, you know, if it's a boy, let's name him after Grandpa. And if it's a girl, well, let's name her Laura. And I remember my face grew hot and red, and they thought that I didn't understand. They said, oh, she doesn't understand her Arabic. I understood. It's just that this was about me standing up for my family and avenging, really, a wrong that had happened to my family. And somehow, in seeking revenge, I had gotten drawn into the enemy's family.
Early in that process, did you ever have moments where you thought, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to stand up right in this room and say, I hate you all. You did a horrible thing to my family.
I can remember walking out of there and feeling like I wanted to break something or someone, especially the first time when they were just kind of gloating about the shooting and sniggering, feeling very full of anger. And my poor husband, every time I came back from their house, you know, there was a lot of tension in our house, and it really because I was just blowing off steam. They did serve me tea all the time, this kind of hot tea, and I remember thinking of it as kind of like swallowing the heat and the pain and the rage. But mostly when I was in their house, I was afraid of being unmasked. I was afraid they figured it out. They shook my hand and my palms were sweaty. They must know why. You know, my forehead would be so tense it would kind of buckle sometimes and scrunch up, and I would think they're reading the truth in my forehead.
And yet, in the end, you ended up unmasking yourself in a dramatic way that's suitable for any movie. We'll get to that when we come back in a moment with Laura Blumenfeld.
Omar gasped. His sister burst into tears, and the judges kind of fell back in their seats. They said to me, why would you do such a thing? Why would you do such a crazy...
During this whole time that you were deceiving this family, visiting with them, learning about the man who tried to kill your father, what did you want to accomplish? What did you think you were going to do?
Well, the question I asked myself was, could I make my father human in a gunman's eyes? Because clearly when this Omar had pulled the trigger on my father wasn't a human being for him. He was actually, in fact, he told me, he thought of my father as a, quote, chosen military target, as if my father were a radar station or some kind of piece of missile equipment. So I wondered if I could do that, and what I decided was I could.
But that wasn't your only goal. I mean, in one part of you wanted to go there and just tear him apart.
That's right. There were two competing impulses. One was this kind of, could I shake him up from the inside and change his point of view? The other was just the kind of feeling that we all have if somebody messes with our child or parent or sibling, which is you want to grab them and shake them and smack them around. It was that visceral rage of...
But your father was okay here, and your father was not sharing the same feeling that you were. What did your family think? Your newlywed husband? Your parents? What did they think of you?
I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my mother at all until this whole thing was over. I told my father only after I had done something. You know, I've met the family, and then I would let him know. I felt like the fewer people who knew, the fewer people would try to stop me. And I was absolutely determined. I had to challenge his mindset. It's true that my father wasn't killed, but the intent was there, if not the outcome. And the more and more I thought about it, I saw that these kinds of attacks didn't begin or end with my father. They were part of a terrorist mindset. And for me, growing up in America, that was the most frightening thing I could imagine, that someone would want to kill me or somebody I cared about just for walking down the street.
All of that said, though, what did you think of yourself? Because most people don't do this.
I had a very hard time with myself. I was separated from the part of me that was loving and lovable, and I knew that. I think that's what revenge, you know, it's not so much what you do to your enemy, it's how you poison your own soul.
Did you entertain, despite your education, despite your upbringing, did you entertain notions of saying, I ought to get a gun and go there and kill them all?
I never thought really about killing them. After all, they didn't kill my father. I like everybody, you fantasize. I interviewed many people about revenge and asked them how much revenge I should seek. And when I was in Iran, I interviewed a grand Ayatollah, the man who was actually responsible for instituting Islam as the part of the judicial system. And I asked him, what does Islam say about this? And this grand Ayatollah told me that, this is hypothetically, I didn't tell him I was actually seeking revenge, but he said that I could take a gun and shoot the shooter, but it would have to hit him exactly in the same way that the bullet had hit my father. Otherwise, the balance of pain is upset, and there'll be another cycle of revenge.
I want to get back to some of your other travels and the other places you learned about in a moment, but let's go to that moment when finally you met the gunman. You had never met him. It was all through letters and everything else. And then a hearing comes up before a court there to see whether or not he should get out of prison. Tell me what happened.
I still didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew that finally, after being a journalist and hiding what was in my heart for over a year, this was my time to act. And I think that we all have to make a decision at some point in our life. We're hurt. How are we going to respond? Is it an eye for an eye? Is it turn the other cheek? And what I found really was a third way, which I call transformation, which says that revenge doesn't have to be about destroying your enemy. It can be about transforming him.
So you went to the court with his family. He was asking to be released, and you started saying to the court, what?
Well, I asked if I could speak, and they said, who are you that you can speak? I wouldn't tell them who I was. Nobody knew who I was, not the judges, not the lawyers, not the family, not the gunman. But I managed to argue my way up to the podium, and I was introduced as anonymous. And this was the defining moment of my life. I was going to decide what kind of person am I. Am I going to strike back, or am I going to somehow try to transform my enemy? And I said, my name is Laura. I come from the United States, and I don't know all the facts of this case, but I have come to know the gunman, Omar Khatib, and I believe that he has made a promise to me, as he had in the letters, that he would never hurt anybody again. And he's sick, he's chronically ill. David Blumenfeld, the victim, I've also communicated with, and he says it's enough. Let him go home. It's time to set him free. Well, the judge started screaming at me and told me to sit down. This is classic hearsay. You don't have a right to speak. You have no right to speak. Who are you? You're just a journalist. And I said, I do have a right to speak. I have a right. They said, no, you don't. They said, why? And I said, because I'm the victim's daughter. I am Laura Blumenfeld. And Omar, gasped. His sister burst into tears. A kind of wind is the only way I can describe it. Went through the courtroom. The judges kind of fell back in their seats. And they said to me, why would you do such a thing? Why would you do such a crazy and dangerous thing, deceiving this family for a year? And I said, because I wanted them to understand that this is not a conflict between disembodied Arabs and Jews. We're people. We have families, and you can't just kill us. And I turned around for the first time and looked at Omar in the eyes, and I said to him, and you promised on your honor that you would never hurt anybody again, and this is a pact now between the Blumenfeld family and the Khatib family. He was just flabbergasted, and he was, the one thing I wanted all along was to shake him up, and he looked shaken. It was a sweet kind of revenge, because I did try to help him, and in the end I performed this kind of radical act, which was impossibly optimistic, thinking that I could change my enemy. I knew I took a risk. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I did a smart thing. Maybe I didn't. But he wrote me a letter afterward and said he hadn't slept for days trying to piece it all together.
And you've been trying to piece together the picture of revenge from all over the world. More on that when we come back with Laura Blumenfeld.
I went to places like Albania, where revenge isn't only tolerated, but it's demanded for even the slightest offense. There's so much revenge in Albania, they have a revenge rule book.
Your story didn't end that day in the courtroom, and in fact, your family and the gunman and his family have all come together and actually met each other recently and talked about this. What was that like?
Well, it was the middle of this violent uprising. My father came to Jerusalem with me, and we traveled this time in a bulletproof van. I used to travel to their house in a public bus and travel around on foot, but we were in a bulletproof van that had actually a bullet hole in it from the day before. We went into their home, and you know, it was an incredibly moving moment. Here was my father, who had been described as a military target, as public relations effort by them, as a human being, and meeting the gunman's mother, and sitting on the couch. To the right of me was my father, a rabbi from America, a Jew, and to the left of me was the gunman's brother, who was an activist with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, had been jailed not only by Israel, but by Jordan for his militant activities. And they were miles apart ideologically, honestly, but there was some kind of connection there. There was something that really happened between them as they smoked a water pipe together and talked about what it was like to have brothers, because my father is one of 3 brothers, and Imad is also one of many brothers.
You traveled to many countries for your book and talked to many people about the ideas of revenge, from Sicily to Albania, places like this. What did you find? Did you find this dehumanizing characteristic to be true everywhere, that when people wanted revenge, they tend to think of the person they want revenge against as a hated object, not a person?
You have to. I mean, revenge demands that division of us versus them, because if you humanize the other person, then revenge becomes killing, and then it's no longer an honorable response. There has to be some kind of honor in defeating the other person. But what I found, which was interesting, is the whole world might dream of getting even, but in America, even the word revenge itself is taboo. So I went to places like Albania, where revenge isn't only tolerated, but it's demanded for even the slightest offense. There's so much revenge in Albania, they have a revenge rule book. It's called the Kanun, and walk into any Albanian home and you might find it on top of the refrigerator, like the phone book. And you can look up the kind of revenge that's prescribed for...
When you look at the wreck that Albania is, however, I've spent time in that country, and it is a shambles.
That's right.
Do you think that the mindset that says revenge is normal and expected is part of what leads to disastrous cultures?
It does lead to disaster, and I think it's one of the reasons why America is such a wonderful place to live and so successful, because our country is very forward-looking. Unlike countries that are steeped in the past and memory, which is the real fuel for revenge, memory and history. We look toward tomorrow. America is about what's next, what's better, even following September 11th. We're looking forward. We're saying to ourselves, how can we gather up charity and donate it and rebuild our country?
Let me ask you briefly here, what about yourself, though? You separated yourself from that mainstream American thought of saying, these guys were already in prison. Your dad was okay. And yet you went seeking revenge.
Well, I was trying to escape the futility of revenge. Revenge has been divided. You know, revenge is this bad thing. The avenger ends up killing himself in the end, and it's self-defeating. I said, that can't be true, because I feel it, and so many other people feel it. Maybe there's a way to take that universal impulse and don't deny it. Build something with it. Build something constructive out of it, I think.
And what you found in that process is what we're going to pick up on when we come back inside Base Camp.
It's a fairy tale, but it's a true one. This really happened.